Welcome back to my channel for returning viewers, and welcome to my channel for any new viewers. As you can see by today's title, today I will be talking about debt. The good, the bad and the ugly. I've had my fair share of experience with debt, and so I'm really excited to shed some light on debt from multiple perspectives. In my video on how to get out of debt fast, which is linked above, I talk about ways to tackle debt head on. And while it's very important to talk about how to tackle debt, it's also important to talk about debt in general. What is good debt, what is bad debt, when it should be avoided, and when it should be used and handled with care. I'm also really excited about this video because I have come together with Johnny from Millennials with Money. He's another great up-and-coming YouTuber and he has fantastic content on his page. We are both really passionate about keeping our finances in check and also help others on their financial journeys, and so we both have tips to share with you on today's video. I have linked his channel down below in the description, so I definitely do recommend going to his page, checking it out, and he's got a unique perspective from a UK European standpoint on personal finance and investing. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Johnny from Millennials with Money to kick off today's discussion.
There's a finance guru in the US called Dave Ramsey who adamantly teaches against the use of debt under any circumstances. He justifies this with a verse from the Bible which talks about the borrower is slave to the lender. And whether you consider yourself a person of faith or not, this statement holds completely true. Whoever you owe money to has all the legal power over you to reclaim that debt by any means necessary, and should you not be able to pay that debt, you run the risk of going bankrupt. But not only are you slave to them in a financial sense, but also in a mental sense. Debt can have a huge impact on people's mental well-being, their mental state of mind, and it can be a real burden mentally. In some circumstances, it may be that debt is the only option and it may be unavoidable depending on what the circumstances are and what you need the money for. However, I would always suggest before going into debt to meet your financial obligations that you consider other alternatives first. The first and obvious answer to avoiding debt is to just save up the money that you need. Now, it's obviously slow and painful, but the advantage is that that's your money. You're not taking on a financial commitment to anybody else. You're not going to have to repay them interest. So in theory, it could work out cheaper to just pay things up front, depending on what it is, by saving the money. An obvious drawback of savings, though, is that we sometimes don't have the luxury of the time that we need to save up that money to be able to pay things off with cash up front. If you're a business or a student, for example, you could consider an option such as grants or scholarships. A grant is an amount of money granted to you that doesn't have to be paid back. For example, in the UK, I'm aware of the Prince's Trust, which at one point, not sure if it still is, was giving out grants to young entrepreneurs with good business ideas. Perhaps your university might give them out if you have a good business idea as well. And in the case of a student, you could consider scholarships, whether you're a talented athlete or whether you're an exceptional academic. Your high level of competence in your field, whether that's sport or whether it's academics, could result in you getting to go to university for free, with the university covering your fees through that scholarship. And another alternative that I personally wouldn't go for, but I have seen some people using, is crowdfunding. So crowdfunding is where you go on a platform, you outline your project, and you ask friends and family and other people to donate to the cause to raise money towards it. This can be a really good way because you probably won't have to pay that money back, and people, if they're really behind the cause, then they are likely to contribute and want to give towards you. However, you could end up with significant scrutiny around how well you perform, around how you use that money, etc., etc. That's why I personally wouldn't go for crowdfunding, but an option you could consider nevertheless. Alright, let's say that none of these options are available, but you still want or still need to pay for something. Should you go into debt to do it? Well, in finance circles, we talk about this concept of good and bad debt. What's that? Good debt? Really? Can debt ever really be good?
Well, yes, debt can actually be a good thing. Good debt is when debt is used to build wealth or increase income over time. So an example of this could be a business loan, for instance. So if you have a business that you're starting and you are in need of certain resources, but you don't have the money in order to buy those resources, a business loan could be considered a good debt in order to advance your business and get it to where it needs to be. Another example of good debt could be a mortgage. Certain circumstances, a mortgage could be a bad debt. The house that somebody owns falls below the mortgage, so it falls into negative equity. However, I will say that in the UK, these instances are quite rare. It's a lot more common for people to be in a better financial place because of a mortgage, but it is not always necessarily the case. And also, a student loan can be an example of a good debt. If there is a specific career that somebody is interested in and it requires them to get certain qualifications, it may be a good idea to take out a student loan in order to get that education, especially if that is your only option to obtain this qualification. Now, we all know that there are certain degrees that you can get and sometimes aren't the most lucrative once you graduate. It's hard to find a job, and the jobs that you do find don't pay well. So in certain circumstances, this may not be the best, but if you have a career plan and you know exactly what it is that you want to do, then it can definitely be a positive form of debt. So sometimes taking out debt is a necessary evil, so to speak, because although debt itself is not positive, it can be necessary at times in order to progress yourself to a place where you are able to increase your income or grow your assets. So Johnny, what do you consider to be bad debt?
So, an example of bad debt might be taking out a loan to buy a car, or the mortgage on your home, or a credit card balance for a purchase you made at the Apple store, for example. Nothing against Apple products, just an example. Now, can you see what all these things have in common? If you looked at them in terms of a financial balance sheet, they wouldn't be considered assets because they don't generate you any income and they don't count towards your wealth. Rather, they count against it. And of course, because it's debt, the reason it counts against your wealth is because it's money that you owe. You have to pay it back to someone else, so that will come out of your assets to get rid of your liabilities. That's why they're considered bad debt. So that may be the case for some of you watching this video, is that you may have some of these liabilities that are outweighing your assets. You may have a car loan that needs paying off. You may have a balance on a credit card that you can't pay off in full. So how do you go about tackling this?
Thanks, Johnny. So when I was 20 years old, I took out my first ever credit card at university. I was studying in the United States because that's where I lived at the time, and so I took out a credit card with the Federal Credit Union, and it had a maximum limit of $500, and I thought, oh my god, I'm a big girl. I finally have a credit card. This is amazing. Now, during my time of university, I paid my credit card in full every single month. I had no issues when it came to paying off my credit card in full. My issue with debt really came into effect when I moved to France in order to obtain my master's degree. Yet again, it was me moving to a new country as I had done in the past, but this time I was moving to this country all by myself. I didn't really have much behind me because I had not long finished my bachelor's degree, and then I spent most of my savings on a backpacking trip around Europe. But there were lots of expenses to pay. I had to furnish my studio and figure out transport, and there were lots of expenses that I wasn't necessarily anticipating for. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Because I never had the opportunity to take out student loans when I was in the US, which of course is not a bad thing, but everyone around me had student loans in the US, all my friends, all my colleagues, and it was just the norm. And then by the time I moved to France, I also couldn't take out any student loans because I wasn't a French citizen and I hadn't been in the UK for so many years. And so I decided to take it upon myself to use my credit card as my loan. So when I needed to furnish my apartment in France and buy new clothes and whatever else I needed to do. I put it on my credit card because I saw that as my loan. Yes, I know how crazy that sounds, but at the time I rationalized it because everybody else around me had student loans and this was my version of a student loan. Now life happened, I moved back to England, and it wasn't until my now husband proposed to me that I got serious about my debt. But the issue was, not only was I needing to tackle my debt, I also needed to save towards a wedding, and I also was saving towards a first home. So as you probably could imagine, this was no easy task, but there were a few things that really helped me to get on the path to debt freedom. The first thing was to get real with the numbers. I needed to know exactly how much I owed and where I owed it. It was very important for me to see the numbers in black and white in front of my face for me to know, okay, this is how much I owe and this is what I'm dealing with. The second thing was to have a clear and detailed debt repayment plan. So now that I knew exactly how much debt that I needed to pay, I needed to have a plan. I needed to know exactly how much I could pay per month and how long it would take me to become debt-free. Personally, I think it's really important to have a goal. If you're just paying off debt and you don't really have an end date, that can sometimes be discouraging. But if you're working towards a date, it is a really great motivation to keep going because you know that this won't go on forever. The other thing was to have a budget. Now, I had always really had a budget, but when I was studying and getting my master's degree, I kind of threw it out the window. But as soon as I finished, I got back to budgeting. Now, as I said before, it was credit cards that got me into this mess in the first place. But of course, there are good uses of credit cards as well. So Johnny, what are some tips that you can share on credit card management?
I've had credit cards, and to ensure that I managed them responsibly, there were a few actions that I took regularly. One was to have either a direct debit readily set up or a reminder to pay off the full balance of my credit card at the end of every month. That way, I only pay the balance that's on the credit card and I'm not charged interest for not making payments on time. The second thing I did to make sure that I could always pay off my balance in full was to make sure that there was enough money in my bank account to cover the full statement at the end of the month. So how did I control my spending with the credit card? How did I not go crazy? Well, that leads me on to the third point, is that I only ever used my credit card for everyday normal expenses that were already in my budget. So going to the supermarket, if I went to a restaurant, if I was paying for my transport card, everyday expenses. I never saw a credit card as a way of buying stuff that I couldn't afford. I saw it as a way of gaining additional perks and additional benefits through my usual spending habits and by just paying with them on the credit card.
Now that I use credit cards as they are supposed to be used, which is pay them off in full each month, I have really capitalized on the benefits of credit cards. And one of these benefits are credit card points. The cards that I personally recommend, especially if you like to travel, are airline credit cards. So for the UK, I have the British Airways American Express credit card. And with this credit card, if you spend a certain amount within the year, you would get a companion voucher. Now, as I said earlier, we did use these credit cards appropriately. So when we used them, we paid them off in full at the end of every month so that we didn't have to pay any interest. But as a result of using this credit card all throughout last year, we were able to get a companion voucher. And this basically is a buy one, get one free flight voucher. For the US, I have a United Airlines Mileage Plus credit card, similar to the British Airways Amex card. If you spend a certain amount of this card, which I think was about $2,000 US, within a 3-month period, you will get around 30,000 air miles. Those amount of air miles will be really great towards future flights. It will either make a flight completely free or it would drastically reduce the price of a flight. Another really amazing thing with this United credit card is that if you pay for basic economy flights, which of course are the cheapest, you still get the privileges of economy. So you'd still get the free baggage, the food on the plane, and the ability to pick your seats.
The final point we're going to cover in this video relates to student loans. Now, although she didn't take out any loans to study, Dee actually studied in both the US and in France. And in those countries, the student loan system runs through commercial banks, and it sometimes does in other European countries, particularly when you're going for a master's program. So D, if there's people watching this video who have this kind of debt, what's the best way they should deal with it, and should they look to pay it off early or should they pay it off little by little?
Student loans in the US are very much in debt and they have to be paid off in full. There is no wiping of debts after 30 years or after a certain time period. Because of this, in the US, it does make sense to make overpayments on your student loans, especially the student loans with the highest interest. If you are able to make overpayments, you are not only able to pay off the debt quicker, but you will pay less interest overall. In France, for European citizens, which unfortunately won't be the UK very, very soon, you are able to get an education for a very low amount. Tuition fees are generally just under €300, and sometimes, as was the case at my university, the books and the materials are included. Now, where things can get really expensive, depending on where you live in France, are the living costs. But there are programs out there such as Erasmus or Cruise, which can help soften the blow of these living expenses. So Johnny, as you've studied in the UK, what was your experience with the student finance system?
So in the UK, that student loan system is very different from what Dee just described for the US and for some of these European countries. In the UK, yes, it's technically a debt because there's an amount next to your name that is owed to be paid back and that generates interest. However, the way this works in practice is a lot different. The repayment conditions are incredibly generous, and it actually works out that the majority of UK students actually will never pay off their student debt in full. Now that might be a bad thing as you first listen to it, but check this out because I think this might change your mind. What I'm going to say here relates primarily to post-2012 student finance loans, but essentially you pay back to student finance based on what you earn once you graduate. You don't start paying back until you earn over about £25,000 for a bachelor's program and £21,000 for a master's program. And in both cases, you only pay back 10% of what you earn over that threshold. And if you take out a UK student loan but you work abroad afterwards, such as is my case, then that threshold might be adjusted up or down based on the living expenses and the average salary in that country. Let's have a look at a quick example based on the student loan calculator on moneysavingexpert.com. Let's assume that a student starts studying in 2017 and they do a 3-year course. For simplicity, we'll say it's not a sandwich course. For those of you that don't know what a sandwich course is, it's essentially a year in industry where you work in a company for 1 year in the middle of your university studies. Now, in England, university studies are very expensive, so let's assume the max. So £9,250 per year. Let's assume a maintenance loan of £4,000. And let's say that their likely starting salary is £25,000. So let's calculate what the situation would be for this student. So as you can see from the results, this debt will be wiped clean after 30 years. And if you look at what they repay, it's about £44,000 over that 30 years. But looking at that in today's money, that's £25,000. So significantly less than what they actually would have paid to go to study at university. And that's why for the majority of people, it doesn't make sense to pay off that loan early. The repayments that you pay back based on what you earn over those 30 years will never cover the cost in full, and it will get wiped in any case. It works out cheaper for you in the long run. And what if during the 30 years after your study, you never earn over the threshold to pay back? Well, you essentially got to go to university for free. You'll never have to pay back that student debt because you were never over the threshold, and your debt will be cleared after 30 years. The only people that it really makes sense for them to pay off that debt early are the really high income earners. Now, Martin Lewis, who has done extensive videos and is very knowledgeable on the topic of UK student loans, says that this is around £39,000. And even if you are one of these really high earners, you want to be sure that there'll be no interruptions to your income in the future, because if you stop working at any point, then you don't need to make repayments. You also want to be absolutely sure that ad income is going to consistently increase and that it's not going to decrease or remain flat at any point. Because if your income remains flat or it goes down, then the amount you repay will also go down. So again, here's another circumstance where it wouldn't make sense to repay early. Now, the topic of UK student finance is huge, and I am barely scratching the surface with this video. There's a video by Martin Lewis where he debunks a lot of myths, a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions around UK student finance, and where he explains the reality of the system. I'll leave that link in the video description for your reference should you want to watch that.
Thank you, Johnny, for sharing your experience with the student finance system in the UK. That is it for today's video. I really hope it's been helpful and insightful. There has been a lot of content in this video, but it was really important for us both to cover debt on a wider array of topics. Good debt, bad debt, alternatives to debt, and student loans. We've covered it all, and we really hope that you've enjoyed it. As I said at the beginning of the video, the link to Johnny's page is down below in the description, so definitely do check him out and click subscribe so that you can also be aware of when he uploads new videos. Until next time, let's get ourselves one step closer to a place of financial freedom.